Actually, let me test your Islamic faith. It is historically known that Muhammad had an adopted son named Zayd bin Haritha, who was also known as Zayd bin Muhammad, meaning Zayd, the son of Muhammad. In the History of At-Tabari, Volume 8, page 2, we read about a very troubling event. Basically, Muhammad went to visit Zayd, but Zayd was not home. Muhammad went to the door and saw Zayd's beautiful wife, Zainab, inside wearing very little clothing. Muhammad then secretly liked Zayd's wife and wanted to marry her. Zayd offered to leave her for Muhammad, but Muhammad told him to keep his wife. On page 4, we read a shorter version of the story. The Messenger of God, meaning Muhammad, had married Zayd bin Haritha to Zainab Bint Jahsh, his paternal aunt's daughter. One day, the Messenger of God went out looking for Zayd. Now, there was a covering of haircloth over the doorway, but the wind had lifted the covering so that the doorway was uncovered. Zainab was in her chamber, undressed, and admiration for her entered the heart of the Prophet. Again, please be honest. In the History of At-Tabari, Volume 8, page 2, we read about a very troubling event. Hi. As you have seen in all my videos, I never attack Muhammad. I simply read Islamic sources and then ask Muslims questions.
He will try to talk to you about tangents. And he'll try to take the conversation in 30 different directions. Hey, by the way, in your tafsir of like Tabari says that, you know, your prophet, blah, 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 blah. And you listen to all of that like, what, Tabari? What are you quoting? Do you even know who Muhammad Tabari was, dude? By the way, those of you that are in the field of da'wah, or you have non-Muslims that come up to you and mess with you, or a class you're taking, and Imam al-Tabari rahimahullah is mentioned, watch out. Imam al-Tabari was a historian. Imam al-Tabari was a historian, and his job was to collect anything that's ever been said about the Quran, right or wrong. He just collected it. He wasn't a mufassir. His tafsir is called Tafsir al-Tabari, but it's really a collection of all manner of quotes, right or wrong. He said, this is what I'm hearing being said about this ayah. He didn't verify it, he didn't collect it. He was just saying historically, he wanted a record that in this century, these kinds of opinions about this ayah existed, whether right or wrong. Now, that becomes amazing ammunition for evangelicals or anti-Islamists or whatever, because they can find all kinds of crazy things in which tafsir Imam al-Tabari, and that's not his opinion, and nor is he saying this is what the Quran means. He's just saying, this is what people be saying about the Quran. Check it out. That's all he did. It was an encyclopedia of quotes. It was imagine it was like the old wiki. You know, it was an old collection of comments, archived. That's what it was. So, you know, we get oh, there was an imam, and he said that in his tafsir. Oh, how are we going to ever respond?
Let me test your Islamic faith.
I wanted to conclude, these are the three primary modes of attack. I wanted to conclude by giving some examples, some lengthy examples. We only have 10 minutes, I'll try to summarize them. The first example, and by the way, I've given 3 tactics. I'm not being exclusive. These are the primary 3 tactics. Also, most of the time, an attack against the honor of our Prophet ﷺ is a combination of these 3. It's not that only one is used. A story is invented, bits of fabrication, bits of distorted truths, bits of cultural values, and then presented. And so an example of this, one example, in a little bit of detail. The story of Zainab Bint Jahsh and the Prophet's marriage to Zainab. Now, Zainab Bint Jahsh was the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was married to Zayd. And Zayd radiallahu anh, was the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ. As you all know, he had adopted Zayd. And so he was called Zayd ibn Muhammad. And just like in our culture, American culture, adopted children and biological children are considered the same. Morally, I'm saying. Morally. If you try to say, no, there's a difference, morally society will say, oh, you're being so mean, you're being so unfair. Cultural values, once again. Islamically, in the beginning period of Islam, it was the same. Adopted children, biological children are the same. And so when the Prophet ﷺ adopted Zayd, his name became Zayd ibn Muhammad. And the wife of Zayd, i.e. Zainab, became the daughter-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ. And as you all know, daughter-in-laws are permanent mahram. Even if the marriage breaks between the son and the wife, the father-in-law always remains a mahram. This is a strange thing, subhanAllah. The husband becomes a non-mahram after the divorce. The husband becomes a non-mahram because after the divorce is over. But the father-in-law remains a mahram forever. So, in this case, when Zayd and Zainab were married, the Prophet ﷺ eventually ended up marrying Zainab. What is the Orientalist version? The Orientalists all agree. There is pretty much ijma', unanimous consensus amongst them, that the version of events goes as follows. The Prophet ﷺ allegedly fell in love with Zainab. He went to visit her in her house, and she opened the door, and she was wearing clothes that typically she would wear when she's sleeping. In other words, not fully dressed up. And that the Prophet ﷺ saw her beauty and was impressed by that and fell in love with her. And when Zayd heard about this, then he divorced his wife so that the Prophet ﷺ could marry her. And Allah Azza wa Jal conveniently revealed, according to them, verses that talk about adopted children are not real children and you can marry their wives. This is the non-Muslim version of events. That the Prophet ﷺ, a'udhu billah, saw Zainab dressed inappropriately, fell in love with her at first sight, and wanted to marry her. So he concocted these verses to say that adopted children are not biological children. The problem with this sequence of events is that it is presented as undisputed fact from within the Islamic tradition. It's as if this is the only version of events. Yet the fact of the matter is that this version is only one version of the story. And let us call this, for lack of a better term, the love story version. There are other versions that exist in classical and medieval texts which are generally considered more acceptable and more authentic. In fact, Sahih al-Bukhari, Tafsir ibn Kathir, the Sirah ibn Ishaq, all of the standard references present a very different picture. Before we get into who's right and wrong, don't you think it's hypocritical for a non-Muslim to come and pounce on the most sensationalist story and ignore all the other versions and then not even tell you the other versions exist? Not even question the fact that there are other versions of the story? Let me give you, for example, the earliest tafsirs written, Tafsir of Abdul Razak in 211, Tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim in 327, the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, the earliest Sirah books written, Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, the earliest Hadith books written, the Hadith of the Sahih of Imam Bukhari. All of these books give a radically different story. What is the story there? The story there is that the Prophet ﷺ was informed by Allah that eventually Zainab would be his wife. And Zayd and Zainab began having arguments and disputes. Zayd did not want to remain married to Zainab. So Zayd came to the Prophet ﷺ wanting a divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ felt awkward because he knew that when that divorce takes place and the iddah is over, Zainab would become his wife, and he himself did not like the cultural taboo of marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he told Zayd, ittaqillah, fear Allah and don't divorce her. He told Zayd not to divorce her. And he feared men's criticism of this cultural taboo. Not that he had love of Zainab. Rather, he was embarrassed at marrying a supposed daughter-in-law. So he wanted to stall it. Zayd wanted a divorce. This is the version of Sahih Bukhari. And the Prophet says, no, you stay with her. Don't divorce her. And Allah Azza wa Jal then revealed verses in Surah Ahzab. Why were you scared of the people? The Prophet says, this is a verse in the Quran. Why were you scared of the people? وَتَخْشَى النَّاسِ. It is more befitting that you are scared of Allah. Shouldn't be embarrassed at the people's statements. There is no love story in Sahih Bukhari, in Ibn Kathir, and all of these books. The question arises, where does this love story exist? Response, again we're getting a little bit academic here, but it exists in a tafsir called Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. And Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, by unanimous consensus, is not a scholar. He's not a historian. He is a storyteller. He is a storyteller. In other words, he's a tabloid paper. He's not the New York Times. Literally, he's a tabloid paper. So the Orientalists, imagine, and I said this at an academic conference when I was defending the story in a certain context. I said, imagine walking into a bookstore, walking into a supermarket, and ignoring the New York Times, ignoring, the Washington Post, ignoring every single reputable, the Times Magazine, Newsweek, and getting your news from the Daily Inquirer, for example. This is the equivalent of what these people are doing. They ignore every single authentic, legitimate book, and they go to the most obscure references. How many of you have even heard of Tafsir Muqatil ibn Sulaiman? Yes, it exists. It's not a fabrication. Meaning the book is not a fabrication. What's inside it might be. But the book itself, it exists. How many of you are aware of it? Nobody. But these guys hunt down these stories, extract them, and popularize them. So this is one example. There are many other examples as well, which we don't have time to get into.
Thank you for watching.